Well, good morning, and welcome to part 6 of the Human Readable podcast. That's where I, Cory Doctorow, am reading my novella Human Readable, as originally published in the Future Washington anthology, in various parts. This is the sixth part, and there will be 7 in total, so this is the next to last one. Thank you for tuning in again. It's Sunday morning here in London, and I've just found out that my flight to Boston was cancelled by that tremendous storm that's hit the northeast. Kind of a pain. It looks like I've managed to rebook. I'm going to fly to Amsterdam tomorrow morning, and I should get to my talk tomorrow at the Bartos Theatre at MIT just about in time. I might be a few minutes late. I land at 4 and my talk is at 5, so it all depends on the traffic and the friendly folks at the Department of Homeland Security as to whether I'm going to get there on time. But I hope to see you folks, those of you who are going to be in Boston at MIT tomorrow night. There's a full schedule of all my talks on craphound.com. I'm going to be at MIT, Harvard, Olin College, and then at Bosco, the Northeastern Regional Science Fiction Convention. I've been up since very early, 5:30 this morning. It's now about 8:30, and I had quite a morning calling around, as you might imagine, rebooking. I thought I'd put in a little anti-plug for British Airways for having the kind of customer service representatives who say things like, "Well, sir, we're not responsible for the weather." Having flown nearly 200,000 miles on BA since last June, I'm well aware that they're not responsible for the weather, but still thought that maybe they could be a little more polite than that. Had a great dinner last night at the St. James restaurant here in London. It's famous for serving offal, that is, bits of animals that aren't normally eaten. So I started with what was it again? It was marrow, which was just delicious, and then had chitterlings, which is intestine, and then a beautiful sponge toffee custard cake for pudding. Oh, was it ever nice? I've got the day off today, which is terrific. I had this plan to fly to Boston and then have dinner and get sorted out and get prepped for tomorrow, and instead I've got a kind of empty free day here in London, so I think I'm going to hit some markets and go to the movies and generally kind of enjoy myself. As I said, this is the next to last part of Human Readable. The last part will be podcast sometime this week, and after that I'm going to kick right into the next book, which will be, or the next story, which will be I, Robot. That's a story that has been on a couple of awards ballots. I mentioned last time around that Human Readable, I, Robot, and my novel Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town are all on the Locus Award ballot. You can find instructions for voting on that at craphound.com. If you liked one or all of them, you could do me a favor and go to their web forum and give me a vote. If you didn't, you might vote for someone else. It's a great award in any event. I, Robot's also been picked up by a couple of the year's best anthologies, so it's you're going to be seeing a lot of it in the next couple of months. So without further ado, here is the Human Readable Podcast, Part 6, the next to last part.
We, as a society, make trade-offs all the time, Rayner said. He was wearing a different suit this evening, something that Trish had to admit looked damn good on the studio monitors, better than her frumpy blouse and wool winterweight trousers. We trade a little bit of privacy for a little bit of security when we show identification before going into a federal building. The Ewok held up his paw. But how much should we be willing to trade, Ms. McCavity? She looked into the camera, keeping her eyes still, the way she'd been told to if she didn't want to appear touretic. Wicket, when Franklin said those willing to give up a little liberty for a little security deserved neither security nor liberty, he wasn't spouting empty rhetoric. He was laying the groundwork for this enduring democratic experiment that we all love. Look, we're not opposed to the use of autonomous networks for some applications, even most applications, with appropriate safeguards and checks and balances. No nation on Earth has the reliance that we do on these networks. Are they an appropriate way of advising you the best way to get to a mall on a busy Saturday? Absolutely, provided that everyone gets the best advice the system can give, regardless of economic status or influence. But should they be used to figure out whom the FBI should open an investigation into? Absolutely not. We use judges and grand juries and evidence to establish the sufficiency of a request to investigate a private citizen who is considered innocent until proven guilty. We learned that lesson the hard way during the War on Terrorism and the Ashcroft witch hunts. Should we trade grand juries and judges for ant colonies? Do you want the warrant for your wiretap issued by an accountable human being or a simulated anthill? The Ewok turned to the camera. Both sides make a compelling case. What do you think? When we come back, we'll take your calls and questions." The lights dimmed and it adjusted its collar and cracked its hairy knuckles on the table before it. Ever since it had made the move to a PBS, it had been grooming its fur ever more conservatively and trying on a series of waistcoats and short pants. It turned to her and stared at her with its saucer-sized black button eyes. "You know, I just wanted to say thanks. I had self-identified as an Ewok since I was 5 years old, but Lucasfilm just wouldn't license it to surgery, so I went through every day feeling like a stranger in my own body. It wasn't until your law got enacted that I was able to find a doctor who'd do it without permission." She shook its paw. "It wasn't my law, but I helped. I'm glad it helped you out." She unconsciously wiped her palm on her thigh as the Ewok turned to his makeup boy and let him comb out its cheeks. She stared at Raynor, who wasn't looking good. She'd had him on the rope since their opening remarks, and the Ewok kept interrupting him to let her rebut, and now she knew why. Raynor had his phone clamped to his head, and he was nodding vigorously and drumming his fingers. He was sweating, and it was making his hair come uncoiffed. Trish's own phone buzzed, and she looked down at it in surprise. It was her voicemail, coming back to life again. It had started when she got to the studio, when she got within a few hundred yards of Raynor, she realized. Messages coming in. She transcribed a dozen in the green room before they dragged her into makeup. The studio lights blinked, and Raynor popped the phone back into his pocket, and the Ewok turned to look back into the camera, examining the ticker scrolling past his prompter. He introduced them again, then turned to Trish. "Ms. McCavity, Alberto in San Juan writes in wanting to know what changes we should institute in the networks." She said, "It's not my place to say what technical changes the networks need to have. That's where experts like Mr. Feinstein come in. We'd ask the administrative branch to solicit comments from people like him to figure out exactly what technical changes could be made to allow us to remain competitive without giving up our fundamental liberties in order to beat the occasional traffic jam." "Mr. Feinstein?" He grinned and leaned forward. "It's interesting that Ms. McCavity should disavow any technical expertise, since that's what we've been saying all along. If she's getting stuck in traffic, it's because there's a lot of traffic. The AntNets route 5,000% more traffic than our nation's highways ever accommodated without them, and they've increased the miles per hour per capita per linear mile by 6,400%. You're stuck in traffic? Fine. I get stuck in traffic sometimes too, but for every hour you spend stuck today, you're saving hundreds of hours relative to the time your parents spent in transit. The other side of this debate are asking for something impossible. They want us to modify the structure of the network, which is a technical construct built out of bits and equations, to accommodate their philosophical objectives. They assert that this is possible, but it's like listening to someone assert that our democracy would be better served if we only had less gravity, or if 2 plus 2 equaled 5. Whether or not that's true, it's not reasonable to ask for it. The Ewok turned to her. She said, "Well, we've heard a great deal about the impossibility of building democratic fundamentals into the network, but nothing about the possibilities. This hard, no-compromise line is belied by the fact that we know that the rich and powerful manipulate the network to their own advantage, something that statistics have proven out. See, this is exactly how those human readable types do it. It's how their media training goes. They're here to ask for changes to technical specifications, but they disavow any technical knowledge. And when they're called on this, they spout dubious statistics that prove that up is down, black is white, and that millionaires can get to the movies in half the time that paupers can. The Emergent Network Suppliers Industry Association represents the foremost experts in this field, but you don't need to be an expert to know that these networks work. The ants take us where we want to go in the shortest time with the highest reliability. Anyone who doubts that can dig out her map and compass and sextant and try to navigate the world without their assistance, the way they do in old Europe." Her mouth was open. Media training? Where do you get this business about media training? "I'm not sure where Mr. Feinstein gets his information about my media training from, but personally, I'd rather talk about networks." She paused. "Let's talk about Europe, where they have found ways of creating transparency and accountability for these unregulatable algorithms, where the sky hasn't fallen and the final trump hasn't sounded. What do they know that we don't?" "What indeed?" the Ewok said, breaking in and giving her the last word again. "More of your questions after this break." They got in their cars together after they'd scrubbed off their makeup and shaken paws with the Ewok, riding down in the elevator shoulder to shoulder, slumped and sweaty and exhausted. They didn't speak, and the silence might have been mistaken for companionable for someone who didn't know any better. They got off at the same floor in the parking garage and turned in the same direction, and Trish spied his car parked next to hers, the last two on the floor. Quickening her steps, she opened her door and turned her car on, backing up so that she was right behind Rayner. He backed out slowly, looking quizzically at her in his rear view, but she refused to meet his eye, and when he pulled out, she rode his bumper. Sweet fancy Moses, she breathed, as the traffic parted before them, allowing them to scythe through the streets onto the beltway. She hung grimly onto his bumper, cutting off cars that tried to shift into her lane. Moving this fast after so much time stuck on the roads, it felt like flying. She laughed, and then got a devilish idea. Spotting a gap in the passing lane, she zipped ahead of Rayner and swerved back into his lane so that she was in the lead. As though a door had slammed shut, the traffic congealed before them into a clot as thick as an aneurysm. She hissed out a note of satisfaction, then waited patiently while Rayner laboriously passed her again, and the traffic melted away once more. It was tempting not to get off at her exit, but she had to get some sleep, and so she reluctantly changed lanes. There wasn't much traffic on the road, but every traffic light glowed vindictive red all the way to her house. The chairman of her board messengered over a handwritten note of congratulations that was on her doorstep. Beneath it was a note from Rayner's great aunt, with the best wishes of his mother in neat pen beneath it. She read its kind words as she boiled the kettle, and then put it into her pile of correspondence to answer. Rayner's great aunt wanted to know if she had met a nice boy in D.C. yet, but she didn't come right out and say it. Too subtle for that. The women in Rayner's family got all the subtlety, and they recognized their own kind. It was why she and the old lady kept writing to each other. That, and so that the relatives could assure themselves that someone in full possession of lifeguardly skills and a level head was watching out for their Rayner's interests. This business of handwritten, hand-delivered notes and letters was actually kind of charming, she thought, as she put her feet up on her coffee table and opened up her flask of very special Irish whiskey again. She and Rayner went head-to-head in a half a dozen more skirmishes that month, her phone popping back to life every time she got within shouting distance of him. The on-again, off-again hearings in both judiciary and commerce never quite materialized. She was better at playing the game, but he was a fast learner, and he had much deeper pockets and working network infrastructure. Her board approved her renting out an empty suite of offices below their office and converting them to bedrooms for her staff for days when their cars wouldn't get them home. They secretly borrowed an elderly network appliances from relatives, or bought them from the dollar-a-pound bin at the Salvation Army, but always within a few hours of being in the possession of someone in the employ of the Association for a Human Readable World, the devices would seize up and lose their routes to the network. Their offices started to fill up with dead soldiers, abandoned network boxes that no one could get online. The embedded journalists went home after the second week. Their own gear was seizing up too, as though the curse of the Association for a Human Readable World was rubbing off on them. They vowed to return when things got interesting again, but they were of no use to anyone without working cameras, mics, or notepads. Christmas came and went, and New Year's, and then February arrived, and the city turned to ice and slush and perpetual twilight. The paralegal quit. She needed a job where the phones worked so that she could call her girlfriend. The media guy took a series of personal days, and she wasn't sure if he'd show up again, but it didn't matter, because the press had stopped calling them. Then came the second downtime. It struck during morning rush hour on Valentine's Day, a Monday, and it juddered the whole country to a halt for 8 long days. The hospitals overflowed, and doctors used motorized scooters to go from one place to another, unable to spread their expertise around with telemedicine. Firemen perished in blaze. Cops arrived too late at crime scenes. Grocery stores didn't get their resupplies, and schools dug out old chalkboards and taught the few students who lived close enough to walk. Fed cops of all description went berserk, and they could be seen walking briskly from one federal building to another, their faces grim. And suddenly, miraculously, every journalist, policy wonk, staffer, advisor, clerk, and cop in D.C. wanted to have a chat with the Association for a Human Readable World.